A man puts a rifle under his chin on a frozen mountain in Colorado. 12 years alone. His wife, gone. His daughter, gone. 17 music boxes carved for the dead, and not a single reason left to breathe. His thumb finds the trigger, and then a woman screams somewhere in the blizzard. The bullet tears through the ceiling instead of his skull. He finds her buried in the snow, half dead, clutching a book of poetry like it matters more than living. She's running from a powerful man who bought her like property, a judge who killed his first wife and will kill again. Now 2 broken people are trapped together in a cabin with a hole in the roof, a storm that won't quit, and dangerous men riding closer every day. He was trying to die. She was trying to survive. And somehow, they became each other's only reason to keep going. Welcome to Wild West Stories channel, where the frontier meets the heart. Tales of cowboys, outlaws, and love as wild and untamed as the West itself. This story will remind you that even the most shattered soul can find a reason to start again, and that real courage isn't never falling. It's standing up one more time than you're knocked down. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story from the Wild West.
Elijah Calloway put the rifle barrel under his chin and closed his eyes. 12 years was long enough. 12 winters alone on this mountain, building music boxes for dead people who could not hear them. Sarah was gone. Lily was gone. And he was so tired of waking up to nothing but silence and the ghosts that lived inside it. His thumb found the trigger. The metal was cold against the underside of his jaw, and the stock pressed into his collarbone. And for the first time in 12 years, Eli felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop fighting what you know is true. That he was broken. That he had been broken since Kansas. That no amount of carving wood and building music boxes and talking to a horse was going to put him back together. From the stable, 30 yards away, Sergeant screamed. Not the sound he made for grizzlies, though that was bad enough. This was the other sound. The one that meant death weather. The kind of storm that killed everything it touched. Eli had heard it 3 times in 12 years. Each time, something on this mountain had died before morning. Tonight, he figured that something would be him. His thumb tightened on the trigger. Then a woman screamed somewhere in the blizzard outside his cabin, and Eli's hand jerked sideways. The shot blew a hole clean through the ceiling. Snow poured in like cold white blood, landing on his shoulder, his hair, the floor around his boots. His ears rang so loud the world went flat. He stood there shaking, alive for no good reason, staring at the hole he had just put in his own roof. The woman screamed again, weaker this time. Further down the slope toward the old stage road, Eli stood in the middle of his cabin with snow drifting onto his shoulders and a voice in his head that said what it always said. Not your business. People die on this mountain every winter. You could not save Sarah. You could not save Lily. You cannot save anyone. Let it go. He put the rifle down on the table, picked it up, put it down again. The third scream came through the storm, and this one sounded like the voice that had been calling Papa in his dreams for 12 years. Eli grabbed his coat off the peg. His hands were still shaking from what he had almost done, and he could not work the buttons, so he left it open. He pulled on snowshoes, took the rifle, the same rifle that still smelled of burnt powder, and kicked the cabin door into the storm. The wind hit him like a freight wagon. Snow drove sideways, thick as wool, turning the world into a white wall that swallowed everything more than 10 feet ahead. December in the Colorado Rockies did not play. This blizzard had been building for 2 days, and it had finally arrived with everything it had. Eli leaned into it and walked. Sergeant screamed again from the lean-to stable as Eli passed. The horse kicked the wall hard enough to crack a board. Eli did not stop. He followed the sound of the woman's voice downslope, snowshoes punching through drifts that reached his thighs. The old stage road was somewhere beneath all this white. The switchback trail connecting Elk Crossing to the Denver Road, a path no sane driver would attempt in weather like this. He found the wreckage 200 yards below his property line. The stagecoach lay on its side in a shallow ravine, one wheel still turning lazy in the wind. Eli pulled up short, rifle raised out of habit. He waited, listened, let his eyes adjust. The horses were down in their traces, some dead, some dying. The dying ones made soft sounds that Eli could not listen to, so he drew his knife and ended it. 4 cuts, fast and clean. He wiped the blade on his coat and moved on. No hesitation, no sentiment, just the work. That was how he survived. Shiloh had taught him that. Feel nothing. Do the work. The driver hung from his seat by one arm, neck broken. Eli did not check for a pulse, did not need to. He had seen enough broken necks in the war to know. A man in a city coat lay face down in the snow near the overturned luggage rack, dead and already freezing solid. Another body 10 feet further, a hired guard, guns still holstered, which meant whatever happened had happened fast. Also dead. A family, husband, wife, and a boy. The boy was maybe 7 years old. His hand still clutched a little wooden toy horse. Eli looked at that hand for a long time. Then he looked away and kept moving. No more screaming now. That was worse. Eli circled the wreck, breathing hard, snow plastering his beard. His boot hit something soft under a drift piled against a boulder. He dropped to his knees and dug with bare hands. A woman's traveling cloak came first. Fine city wool, completely useless in this country. Then a gloved hand, small enough to belong to a child. He dug faster. She lay curled on her side, arms wrapped around a leather satchel pressed to her chest. Auburn hair frozen to her cheeks, lips the color of ash, eyes closed. The leather strap of the satchel was wound so tight around her wrist it had left marks. She had been holding on to it even unconscious, even dying. Whatever was inside mattered to her more than living. Eli pressed 2 fingers to her throat and held his breath. Nothing. He pressed harder, moving his fingers, searching. There. A flutter so faint it could have been his own heartbeat echoing back. But it was not. She was alive, barely, impossibly, stupidly alive in a place and a storm that should have killed her hours ago. "All right," he said through his teeth. "All right, then." He scooped her up. She weighed nothing, a bundle of wet fabric and frozen skin, and whatever stubborn thing inside her refused to stop beating. Her head fell against his shoulder. Her lips moved without sound. Eli turned uphill and started climbing. The trail back to the cabin took 20 minutes in good weather. Tonight, it took over an hour. Every step was a fight against the snow, the grade, the wind, and the 60 extra pounds of dying woman in his arms. His bad knee screamed from the old Shiloh wound. He ignored it. His lungs burned in the thin air. He ignored that too. The voice in his head was harder to ignore. "Put her down. She is dead already. You could not save Sarah. You could not save Lily. You could not save any of those boys bleeding out in the Tennessee mud. What makes you think you can save this one?" "Shut up," Eli said out loud and kept climbing. He kicked open the cabin door and carried her inside. The fire had burned to coals while he had been out doing what he had been doing before the scream. He did not look at the hole in the ceiling, did not look at the place where the rifle had been. Just laid the woman on the floor in front of the hearth and threw every piece of split wood onto the coals until the fire roared back to life. Her clothes were killing her. Every layer of that fine city fabric was soaked through, holding the cold against her skin like a hand pressing ice to bare flesh. Hypothermia worked from the outside in, and she was already so far gone, her lips had turned gray. "Forgive me," he said quietly. He unbuttoned her dress with fingers that fumbled on the tiny pearl buttons, then the corset laces, then the petticoats, layer after layer of feminine armor designed for Philadelphia parlors, not Colorado blizzards. He kept his eyes on his hands, on the work. The way he had kept his eyes on the surgical tent walls while army doctors sawed off limbs beside him at Shiloh. When she lay in only a thin cotton shift, he wrapped her in the heavy buffalo robe from his own bed, tucked it tight around her body and feet, and built the fire higher. Then he sat back on his heels and watched her breathe, in, out, in, out. Each breath barely moved the robe. He counted them the way he used to count ammunition. Each one a small victory, a tiny rebellion against the blizzard still hammering the walls outside. Her satchel lay where it had fallen when he set her down. He opened it, not from curiosity. He needed to know who she was in case she died and somebody came asking. Inside, he found a few coins, a change of underclothes, and a book, a thin volume of poetry, pages swollen with water. He opened it to the inside cover. A woman's handwriting in faded blue ink. For my Clara. May you always find the words. Love, Papa. Eli stared at the inscription for a long time. Then he set the book near the fire, fanning the pages open so they could dry without sticking together. He weighted each page with small stones from the hearth, smoothing them flat so the words would survive. Then he noticed the other thing in the satchel. A folded document, thick paper with a wax seal half dissolved by water. He could make out a few words before the ink blurred into nothing. Contract, obligation, and a name. Theodore. Eli put it back. He looked at the woman's face in the firelight. Auburn hair drying in curls against the buffalo robe. A bruise on her forehead from the crash. Hands that were small and rough at the knuckles in a way that did not match the fine city clothes. Who runs through a December blizzard carrying a book of poetry and a contract? Only someone running from something worse than dying. Eli sat back in his chair and laid the rifle across his knees. On the shelf above the fireplace, 17 music boxes stood in a row, each one carved from a different wood, each one holding a different melody and a different apology. They watched him the way they always watched him, silent, patient, waiting for him to add another name to the collection. Not tonight, Eli told them. He looked at the woman breathing on his floor, and then he looked at the hole in his ceiling where the bullet had gone through. And he sat there in the dark with snow drifting down onto his shoulders and wondered what kind of God sends a dying woman to a man who is trying to die. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his chair and counted her breaths until dawn. Clara Mercer woke the way she had learned to wake since she was 19 years old. She found the exits before she opened her eyes. Sound first. The crack and pop of a fire. Wind against walls but muffled, which meant she was inside something solid. A rhythmic scraping sound she could not identify. Then smell. Burning pine. Coffee, strong and bitter. Something underneath that was animal hide and wood smoke and a masculine scent she did not recognize. She opened her eyes. Rough timber ceiling above her. A square patch of new wood directly overhead, lighter than the rest, as though someone had recently nailed a board over a hole. Firelight danced across the rafters and made shadows that moved like living things. She turned her head. A large man sat 3 feet away in a wooden chair with a rifle across his knees. He was watching her. His face was broad and weathered, with a scar that ran from his left temple down his jaw and disappeared into a dark beard. His eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of morning fog, but the hard gray of granite, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not read. Clara did not scream. She had lived with fear long enough to know that screaming did not help. Screaming was what you did when you believed someone would come. Clara had stopped believing that a long time ago. She assessed. Distance to the door, 8 feet, barred from the inside. Her clothes hung by the fire, steaming. A buffalo robe covered her body. She was wearing only her thin cotton shift underneath. A fire poker stood in the hearth tools, 2 feet from her right hand. She moved, rolled sideways, grabbed the poker, put her back against the wall. All in 3 seconds. The buffalo robe fell from one shoulder. She did not fix it. Weapon first, dignity second. Stay back, she said. Her voice cracked from disuse and cold, but the poker did not waver. "Stay right there." The man raised both hands, palms out, slowly, like a man who had done this before. "You are safe," he said. His voice was low and rough, as though he had not used it much. "I will decide that for myself." Clara adjusted her grip on the poker. "Where am I? Who are you? What happened?" "You are in my cabin on Elk Ridge. My name is Elijah Calloway. Your stagecoach went over in the ravine 200 yards below my property line. I found you buried in the snow last night and carried you up here. My clothes, wet. Wet clothes kill faster than the cold. I did what needed doing and nothing more. How convenient." The poker pointed at his chest. A man alone in a cabin with an unconscious woman. And he only did what needed doing. I have heard that story before. Something in her voice, not just fear, but a particular kind of bitterness, made him look at her differently. She saw it happen. The shift in his eyes from defensive to something quieter. "I reckon you have," he said slowly. "But I am not whoever taught you to expect the worst from men. I am just the fool who carried you up a mountain in a blizzard instead of minding his own business." That landed. Clara felt it. She kept the poker up, but her grip loosened a fraction. "The other passengers," she said, "all dead." The word hit her like a physical blow. The Callahans. Mrs. Callahan, who had shared her lunch at the way station. Mr. Callahan, who had tipped his hat and called her Miss. And James. Little James with his wooden horse who had shown it to her so proudly, holding it up for her to see. Clara pressed her knuckles against her mouth and fought. Fought the way she had learned to fight, by swallowing it whole, by pressing it down into the place where she kept everything that would destroy her if she let it out. "You do not have to hold it in," Eli said. "Yes, I do." She said it flat. The way someone says it when they have been told to stop crying too many times in their life. "Yes, I do." She won the fight, barely. Dragged a breath through her teeth and straightened against the wall. The poker came back up. "How long am I trapped here?" Storm could last 3 days. Could last a week. A week. Clara's stomach dropped, but she kept her face still. "Colorado does not care about your schedule." Clara looked toward the window. Nothing out there but white fury and darkness and the scream of wind against glass. She looked back at Eli and something shifted. Not trust. Too soon for trust, but a calculation. This man pulled me from the snow when he could have left me. Dead men do not rescue people. She lowered the poker. Did not let go of it, but lowered it. "My name is Clara Mercer." "I know." "The book in your bag, your papa's inscription." Pain crossed her face quick as lightning. "You went through my things, needed to know who you were in case you died and somebody came looking. Practical. I am a practical man. Is that what you call living alone on a mountain? I call it minding my own business. Something I was doing just fine before you crashed a stagecoach on my doorstep." That almost got a laugh. Not quite. But the corner of her mouth moved, and Eli noticed. And something in him noticed that he noticed, and he looked away fast. "You need food," he said. "I need answers. You need food first. Answers do not mean much to a corpse." He stood and ladled stew from the iron pot hanging by the fire. Venison, wild onion, cattail root. He held the bowl out to her. Clara took it with one hand, the other still on the poker. She sniffed the stew, took a cautious bite. "Need salt," she said. Eli stared at her. She took another bite. "Salt is on the shelf," he said after a moment. "Help yourself." He pulled on his coat and moved to the door. "I will be outside checking on my horse. Door is not barred. You want to run into the blizzard in a nightgown, that is your choice. I would recommend against it." He stepped outside before she could answer. The door closed behind him and Clara sat alone by the fire with a poker in one hand and a bowl of stew in the other. She found the salt, finished the stew. It was dense and savory, and the best thing she had eaten since Chicago, and the salt made it better. She set the bowl down and looked around the cabin for the first time without the filter of immediate fear. The furniture was handmade. Not rough frontier work, but careful craftsmanship. The table surface was smooth as glass. The chairs had curved backs that fit the body. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. Shelves held preserved meat, tin cans, flour, coffee, a few bottles of whiskey. Everything had its place. Everything was clean. This was not the cabin of a man who had given up. This was the cabin of a man who had turned survival into something almost beautiful. Then she saw the music boxes, 17 of them, lined up on the shelf above the fireplace. Each one carved from a different wood, some simple, some ornate. All clearly made by hands that understood what they were doing. Clara did not touch them. She had learned enough about boundaries in the last 3 months to recognize when something was not hers to open. Instead, she found her father's book of poetry where someone had laid it open near the fire. The pages were fanned out and weighted with small stones to keep them flat while they dried. Someone had done this with care, with patience, smoothing each page so the words would survive. Clara ran her thumb across her father's inscription and felt her throat close. The cabin door opened. Eli came back in, brushing snow from his shoulders. He stopped when he saw her sitting by the fire with the book in her hands. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Eli crossed to his chair, sat down, and picked up a block of walnut wood from the workbench beside him. He began to carve without speaking. Two strangers in a small room, each holding the thing that mattered most to them. And for the first time in this cabin, the silence had 2 heartbeats instead of 1. Clara set the book down carefully and pulled the buffalo robe around her shoulders. She looked at the patch on the ceiling. New wood, not yet darkened. The hole, she said. How long ago? Eli did not look up from his carving. Same night I found you. Clara stood on the ladder rung for a long time. The cabin was warm below her. The straw mattress in the loft waited above. Between them, a man sat carving wood by firelight with hands that were steady and sure, and had almost ended his own life hours ago. I'm glad you missed, she said quietly. She climbed into the loft and disappeared. Below her, Eli sat motionless. The carving knife rested against the walnut block. The 18th music box, half finished. No melody chosen. No name carved on the bottom. For the first time in 12 years, his hands did not want to carve a dead person's name. On the second morning, Clara asked Eli to teach her to trap rabbits. Eli said no. Clara pulled on the snowshoes she had found by the door, the ones that were too big for her feet but small enough to be a woman's, and walked out into the blizzard without asking again. Eli stood at the window and watched her make it 30 yards before she stepped wrong and sank to her hip in a drift. She hauled herself out, took 3 more steps, sank again. He swore under his breath, grabbed his coat, and followed. Those were Sarah's snowshoes, he said when he caught up to her. Clara looked at him. The wind was tearing at her hair and her cheeks were already red from the cold and she was breathing hard. She did not apologize. They fit close enough, she said. Eli studied her for a long moment. The blizzard howled around them. Snow drove sideways, plastering them both. You follow exactly where I step, he said. You touch nothing unless I say, and when I say move, you move. This mountain does not care that you are from Philadelphia. I am beginning to understand that. Eli turned and started breaking trail. Clara stepped into his prints and followed. The storm had weakened enough to move through, but not enough to be comfortable. Nothing about this mountain was comfortable. The snow lay thigh-deep in the open and chest-deep in the drifts, and even with snowshoes it was hard going. The shoes distributed her weight but required a wide, rolling gait that burned muscles Clara did not know she had. 20 minutes in, her thighs were on fire. 30 minutes in, she stumbled and caught herself on a tree trunk. Eli stopped and looked back. Need to rest? He asked. No. Stubborn, practical. You said food was a problem. Standing here does not fix it. The barest twitch of his mouth. Clara was starting to recognize it as the Eli Calloway equivalent of a grin. He taught her as they walked. "Breathe through your nose," he said without turning around. "Slow. Mouth breathing will freeze your throat in air this cold." She obeyed, forcing herself to inhale through her nose despite every instinct screaming to gulp air. He taught her to read the snow. "See those tracks," he said, pointing at a pattern of small prints near a fallen log. "Rabbit. Runs this path every night, coming from the brambles east to the creek bed west. You set a snare where the tracks funnel between two obstacles. Rabbit does not change its path. Creatures of habit. Like people," Clara said. Eli glanced back at her. "Like people," he agreed. He taught her to listen. "Fresh powder sounds different from hardpack," he said. "Fresh powder is quiet. Absorbs everything. Hardpack squeaks under your weight. If you are walking on hardpack and it stops squeaking, you are on a snow bridge over a crevice or a creek, and you need to move slow." As if to prove his point, Clara stepped off his track and the snow gave way beneath her. She dropped to her waist with a gasp, one leg plunging into empty space beneath the snow. A rock crevice opened below, and for one terrible second she felt nothing under her boot but air. Eli's hand clamped around her arm and hauled her out in one motion. He was strong, stronger than she had expected. He set her on solid ground and let go immediately. "Step where I step," he said. No heat in his voice. No "I told you so." Just fact. This mountain does not give second lessons. Clara nodded. Her heart was hammering. She stepped back into his tracks and did not deviate again. The first trap was empty. The second held a rabbit, frozen stiff and half buried in snow. Eli knelt beside it and freed it from the snare with practiced hands. "Quick and clean," he said. "That is the only rule. The animal gave its life so we can eat. We do not waste that. We do not let it suffer. We say thank you and mean it. You say thank you to a dead rabbit. I say thank you to anything that keeps me alive. Been doing it since Shiloh." The name landed between them like a stone in still water. Shiloh. Clara knew it from her father's newspaper archives. A Civil War battle. 10,000 dead in 2 days. She filed the name away and said nothing. Eli showed her how to reset the snare, where to place the wire, how to anchor it, how to read the snow for the tracks that told you where rabbits ran. Clara watched and memorized the way she had memorized her father's bookkeeping and the shipping schedules she had stolen from her stepfather's office to plan her escape. Learning was how Clara Mercer survived. It always had been. She tried to set the next snare herself. Her fingers understood the technique. She had watched once and remembered every step. But her hands were not strong enough to pull the trap wire taut. The snare she set was loose, floppy. It would not catch anything. She tried again, same result. Her fingers simply did not have the strength. "Takes time," Eli said. He did not fix it for her, did not reach over and tighten it, just set it and moved on. Clara looked at the loose snare and felt a frustration that went deeper than rabbits. 3 months of running, and she still could not do the simplest things this world required. The third trap was sprung but empty. The fourth held another rabbit. By the time they had checked all 6, Clara's fingers were numb, her face was raw from wind, and she was carrying 2 frozen rabbits in a canvas sack slung over her shoulder. On the way back, she fell twice. The second time, she lay in the snow for 5 full seconds, staring up at the gray sky through the swirling flakes, and started laughing. It came out of nowhere, the absurdity of it. Clara Mercer, who had attended poetry readings in Philadelphia parlors, who had served tea to circuit judges in silk gloves, lying in a snowdrift on a Colorado mountain carrying dead rabbits. Eli stopped and looked back. Clara lay in the snow laughing, and for a moment his face did something she had not seen before. The granite softened, just for a second. Then he turned forward and kept walking, but slower. He walked slower on the way back, and Clara did not notice, but the mountain did. Back at the cabin, warmth hit her like a blessing. She stood by the fire, flexing her frozen fingers while Eli laid out the rabbits on the workbench. "Now comes the hard part," he said. He picked up a knife and began skinning the first rabbit with a speed that spoke of years of practice, quick, efficient, almost gentle. "I need to learn that too," Clara said. Eli glanced up. "Everything," she said. "If I'm going to eat what this mountain provides, I should understand what it costs." He handed her a knife, smaller than his, with a worn wooden handle. "Watch first, then try." She watched. Then she tried. Her hands shook and her stomach turned, and halfway through the second rabbit she stumbled to the door and vomited into the snow. She came back in, wiping her mouth, cheeks burning with shame. "Sorry," she said. Eli did not look up from his work. "First time I did too. Second time too. Third time I just wanted to." Clara looked at him. It was the first time he had volunteered anything about himself that was not forced out by circumstance. He had offered it freely, like handing someone a cup of water. Small, simple, and it mattered more than he probably knew. She picked up the knife and finished the rabbit. Not clean, not fast, but done. That evening, while Eli was in the stable checking on Sargent, Clara opened the table drawer looking for a small knife to trim the damaged binding on her father's book. She did not find a knife. She found a letter. It was creased and opened, dated 2 weeks before the blizzard. From a law office in Denver. The handwriting was formal, precise. "Dear Mr. Calloway, we have received inquiries regarding your person from parties in the eastern states. Specifically, questions have been raised about one Elijah Calloway, formerly of Lawrence County, Kansas, regarding the circumstances of a fire at a homestead property in 1863. We advise you to contact our office at your earliest convenience." Clara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the drawer, and closed it. Someone was looking for Eli, not Harlow. This letter predated her arrival by weeks. Someone else entirely was asking questions about a fire in Kansas. She said nothing about it when Eli returned, but the letter sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe, and she could not stop thinking about it. That night, as Eli checked the traps he had set near the cabin perimeter, he found something that stopped him cold. Tracks at the far edge of his property line. Shod hoof prints. 3 horses riding in a line. Not deer. Not wild Mustang. Ridden horses. In a blizzard. Moving with purpose. He knelt beside the tracks and studied them. The snow was filling them fast, but they were fresh. Hours old at most. Someone had ridden past his property in the worst storm in a decade. No one did that without a reason. Eli erased the tracks with his boot. He took a longer route back to the cabin, circling through the tree line, checking for more signs. He found none. But the feeling stayed with him, the old soldier's instinct that said someone was watching. Back inside, he cleaned the rifle, loaded extra rounds, checked the action twice. Clara lay in the loft above him, and he could hear her breathing in the quiet rhythm of someone pretending to sleep. She was not asleep. She was listening to the sound of metal, the click and slide of a rifle being loaded, the careful, deliberate sounds of a man preparing for something. 2 nights ago, she thought, this man put a gun under his chin. Tonight, he is loading it to protect something. She did not ask what. She was afraid of the answer, more afraid it might be her. On the 3rd day, Clara split her first piece of firewood clean through. She stood in the lean-to-stable doorway where the wind could not reach, holding the hatchet Eli had given her, staring at the 2 perfect halves like she had just performed surgery. Her palms were destroyed. Blisters had formed, broken and bled twice since Eli started teaching her. The wooden handle of the hatchet was stained dark with it. But the wood was split, and she had done it herself. And the feeling that moved through her chest was something she had not felt since her father was alive. Again, Eli said from behind her, "I just did it once. One piece does not keep a fire burning." Again. Clara set another log on the block and swung. This one split crooked, but it split. She set another and another. By the time Eli said enough, she had a small pile at her feet and hands so sore she could not straighten her fingers. "You did not say good job," she said, flexing her hands. Eli picked up the pile and carried it toward the cabin. At the door, he paused, did not quite turn around, and said it. Good job. Clara smiled. Then she stopped smiling because she realized it was the first real smile in longer than she could remember, and it had come from a man who rationed words like ammunition. That afternoon, Eli went out to check on Sargent and walk the perimeter. Clara was alone in the cabin for the first time. She moved through the space the way she moved through every new room, reading it for safety, for exits, for the things people kept hidden. The furniture told a story she had not expected. Every piece was handmade with a precision that bordered on artistry. The table surface was smooth as glass, the grain visible beneath a hand-rubbed finish that must have taken hours. The chairs had backs curved to fit a human spine. Even the shelf brackets were carved with a simple vine pattern that served no purpose except beauty. This man had spent 12 years alone on a mountain and had filled it with things he made beautiful for no one but himself. Or maybe not for himself. Maybe for the ghosts he was keeping company. The music boxes drew her eye the way they always did. 17 of them lined up on the shelf above the fireplace like wooden soldiers standing guard. She had not touched them since the first night. But now, alone, with Eli outside and the fire popping and the storm humming against the walls, she reached for one. The simplest, unfinished pine, no decoration, smaller than the others. She told herself she would just look at it, just hold it. She opened the lid. The melody that came out changed the air in the cabin. A lullaby, simple and slow and so full of sorrow that Clara felt it in her breastbone. It was the kind of melody a man hums to a child in the dark. The kind that says, I am here and everything will be all right and I love you more than I know how to say. Clara turned the box over. On the bottom, carved in a careful hand, Lily, my daughter, 1859 to 1862. Papa is sorry. She closed the box. The melody stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the song. She heard the cabin door and turned. Eli stood in the doorway, snow on his shoulders, cold on his face. His eyes went from Clara to the music box in her hands, and his face changed. Not anger. She had been braced for anger and could have handled anger. What happened instead was worse. His face went blank, empty, like someone had reached behind his eyes and turned out the light. I should not have, Clara began. No, you should not have. He crossed to the workbench and put his back to her. His hands were flat on the wood surface, and his shoulders were set in a line that said, Do not come closer. Clara put the music box back on the shelf. I am sorry, she said. I did not know. Now you do. The silence stretched. Clara should have left it alone. Every survival instinct she had said, Leave it alone, do not push, do not ask. But she was tired of leaving things alone. Tired of silence and secrets, and the things men kept locked inside themselves while the people around them drowned in the not knowing. Will you tell me? She asked. Eli did not move, did not turn. For so long that Clara thought he would not answer at all. Then he spoke, and his voice was flat. Not angry flat, worn flat, smooth like a river stone that has been tumbled so many times there are no edges left. Sarah and Lily, he said, my wife and my daughter. Diphtheria took them in 1862 while I was fighting at Shiloh. I was 400 miles away cleaning my rifle while my baby girl was dying. She was 3 years old. She did not know why her papa was not there. She just knew he was not. He paused. The neighbors told me she called for me at the end. Papa. She kept saying, Papa. Papa, come home. Clara felt tears burn her eyes, but Eli was not crying. His voice had not cracked. He told it the way a soldier reports a casualty. Flat, factual. And the flatness was the most terrible thing Clara had ever heard, because it meant he had told himself this story 1,000 times until the words had worn smooth, and the pain underneath was so deep it no longer had a surface to break through. She did not comfort him, did not say, I understand, or I am sorry for your loss, or any of the words people say when they have nothing to say that matters. Instead, she said this, The melody is beautiful. She must have loved it. Eli turned his head. Not all the way around, just enough to see her from the corner of his eye. He looked at her for a long time with an expression she could not read. Then he turned back to the workbench and picked up his carving knife. "I built the first music box that winter," he said. "Sarah's Lullaby. Thought if I could just hear the melody, maybe the silence would not eat me alive." He looked at the shelf. 17 boxes later, he said, "The silence is still winning." "Maybe silence is not the enemy," Clara said softly. "Maybe loneliness is. And those are not the same thing." Eli said nothing, but his hands, which had been still, began to move again. Carving, the walnut block that would become the 18th music box. And Clara understood that he had heard her, even if he could not answer. That evening they sat by the fire, and Clara gave back what he had given her, an exchange, a trade, pain for pain, truth for truth, the oldest currency between two people who have nothing else to offer. "My father was a poet," she said. "He ran a bookshop in Philadelphia. Small place, always smelled like ink and paper, and the lavender he kept in bowls on the counter because my mother liked it. He died when I was 16. Consumption. Took him slow. By the end, he could not hold a pen, but he could still recite Whitman from memory." She stared into the fire. Her mother remarried. A man named Phelps who accumulated debts the way some men accumulate horses, carelessly and constantly. When the debts grew bigger than the house, bigger than the bookshop, bigger than everything her father had built, Phelps found a solution. "Theodore Harlow," Clara said. "Circuit judge, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 58 years old. Well-connected, well-respected, the kind of man other men call a pillar of the community." She paused. "Phelps owed him money. The kind of money that makes men creative about repayment." "He sold you." Eli said it flat. Not a question. Clara flinched. Not because it was wrong. Because no one had ever said it that plainly. Not her mother, who called it a sensible arrangement. Not her sisters, who cried, but said nothing. Not the lawyer who drew up the marriage contract with terms that read like a bill of sale. "Yes," Clara said, "he sold me. $300. That was my price." Eli's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara's voice dropped when she told the next part. "The first wife, Martha Harlow, died falling down the stairs in Theodore's house, 6 steps, carpeted. I talked to the housekeeper," Clara said. "She came to see me the week before the wedding. Told me things about the bruises Martha tried to hide, about the locked rooms, about the night Martha died, and how Theodore called the doctor himself and was already dressed for company when the man arrived, though it was past midnight." She met Eli's eyes. "Martha did not fall," she said. "She was pushed. And I was going to be next." Something changed in Eli's face. Not surprise. He had seen too much of the world for surprise, but a hardening. The same look she imagined he had worn looking across a battlefield. Clara pulled the satchel into her lap and drew out the water-damaged document. She unfolded it carefully. "I did not just run," she said. "I stole this. The original marriage contract. Theodore's signature, my stepfather's signature. The terms, the price. Without it, Theodore has no legal proof of his claim on me. This is why I held onto the bag even when I was dying, and this is why he will never stop looking." She told him the rest. The clause, the deadline, January 15th. If Clara did not return by then, her stepfather's debt to Harlow doubled, and Harlow gained legal standing to pursue the entire Mercer family. Margaret and Jane, Clara's sisters, would lose their home, their father's bookshop, everything. Clara's hands shook when she said the date. 31 days. Every day I stay on this mountain, she said, costs my sisters something real. The fire popped. Snow pressed against the window. The weight of what she had just said filled the cabin like water filling a well. Eli was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, crossed to the shelf, and took down Lily's music box. The one Clara had opened, the one that played the lullaby. He held it for a moment, looking at it. Then he placed it in Clara's hands. "Keep it tonight," he said. She did not like being alone in the dark. He turned away before Clara could see his face, but she saw his shoulders, the way they dropped. For the first time since she had known him, they lowered, as though someone had set down something heavy. Clara held the music box against her chest and climbed the ladder to the loft. She did not open it, did not play the melody, just held it and felt the smooth wood under her fingers and the weight of a dead man's love for his dead daughter, and the impossible fragile thing that was starting to grow in the space between herself and the man below. On the fourth day, the storm eased enough to see the tree line from the cabin window. Eli told Clara he was riding Sergeant down to Elk Crossing for provisions. "Stay here," he said. "I will be back before dark." Clara said, "All right." Eli saddled Sergeant and started down the slope. He made it halfway before he heard the distinctive crunch of snowshoes behind him. He did not turn around. He breathed out through his nose and slowed his pace. Elk Crossing appeared around a bend in the trail after 2 hours of hard riding. A cluster of buildings huddled in a valley like a handful of dice thrown against the mountains. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere. The ordinary sounds of human life after 7 days of isolation hit Clara like stepping from a dark room into sunlight. Nettie Rollins stood behind the counter of her general store, a thin woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She watched Eli walk through her door with a woman beside him and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. For Nettie Rollins, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Well," Nettie said, "am I dead and gone to heaven? Because Elijah Calloway just walked into my store with a woman. Nettie, this is Clara Mercer. I can see who she is." Nettie looked Clara up and down with the frank appraisal of a woman who had survived 30 years on the frontier and did not waste time on pleasantries. "Question is why she is wearing what looks like a dead woman's coat, and you are wearing an expression I have not seen on your face in 12 years. It is a long story. I've got coffee." Nettie poured 3 cups of the worst coffee Clara had ever tasted, strong enough to strip varnish, and settled behind the counter with the look of a woman who intended to hear every word. Clara told her the short version: the stagecoach, the crash, Eli's rescue. She left out the bullet hole in the ceiling. Some things were not hers to tell. Nettie listened without interrupting, which Clara later learned was a thing Nettie Rollins almost never did. When Clara finished, Nettie looked at Eli. "How much extra did you buy today?" Eli did not answer. "Because I notice you have got double flour, double salt, double coffee, and ammunition on top of it. 12 years, Elijah Calloway. Not once have you bought extra provisions. This old woman can read a bill of sale better than she can read a book." Eli picked up a sack of flour and slung it over his shoulder. "Put it on my account," he said, and walked out. Nettie watched him go, then turned to Clara. "He talks to that horse more than he talks to people. If you have gotten 3 full sentences out of him in a day, you are doing better than anyone in this territory." "I got 4, Clara said, "and one of them was good job." Nettie stared at her. Then she laughed. A big, rough laugh that did not match her thin frame but suited her perfectly. "You will do fine," Nettie said. Outside, Clara walked along the main street while Eli loaded Sergeant. She took in the town. A saloon with a crooked sign. A blacksmith's forge where a tall, dark-skinned man worked iron in the open air despite the cold, his hammer ringing in a steady rhythm. He glanced at Clara once, then looked past her to Eli, and the 2 men exchanged a nod that contained more communication than most conversations. "That is Tom Brightwater," Eli said when Clara asked. "Ute, mixed blood, best blacksmith in 50 miles, does not talk much. You and he must get along wonderfully." Eli gave her a look. Clara kept her face straight. A younger man with a sheriff's star on his coat crossed the street and stopped when he saw Eli. He had the weathered face of someone who had lived hard but honest, and his eyes went from Eli to Clara and back again with a curiosity he did not bother to hide. "Jack Mackey," Eli said. "Sheriff. We served together in the 33rd Indiana." Mackie tipped his hat to Clara. "Ma'am, you must be the reason Eli came down off that mountain looking like a man who has just seen a sunrise for the first time." "I crashed a stagecoach on his property," Clara said. "He has been complaining about it ever since." Mackie laughed. Eli did not laugh, but the granite in his face shifted, just enough to notice. From across the street, a man stood in the saloon doorway watching Clara. Billy Akins. She did not know his name yet, but she recognized the look. Measuring eyes. The kind of eyes that calculated what information was worth to the right buyer. Eli clocked it too. His jaw tightened, and his hand moved to rest on the rifle in Sergeant's saddle scabbard. Not a threat. A reminder. On the ride home, doubled up on Sergeant because the mountain only had one horse, Eli spoke without looking at her. "Someone has been asking about a woman who traveled the Denver stage line." Clara went rigid against his chest. "Nobody has asked the right place yet," Eli said, "but they will." Silence. The creak of leather. Sergeant's hooves punching through hardpack. "How do you know?" Clara asked. "Nettie hears everything. And Billy Akins sells everything he hears." Clara stared at the trail ahead. The mountain loomed above them, white and enormous and indifferent. That evening back at the cabin, Clara asked Eli to teach her to carve. Her hands were raw from the day, blisters on blisters, but she needed something to do with them. "Idle hands mean trouble," she said. "My mother used to say that." "Smart woman," Eli said. He pulled a block of pine from a shelf and brought it to the fire with a small knife. He sat in his chair. Clara moved to the floor beside him, closer than either of them had allowed before. She felt him tense, a slight tightening across his shoulders. But he did not pull away. "Pine is soft," he said, turning the block in his hands. "Forgiving. Good for learning." He showed her how to hold the knife, how to cut with the grain, how to read the wood, and let it tell you what it wanted to become. His hand closed over hers to demonstrate the angle, and Clara felt the warmth of his palm against her knuckles, the calluses rough against her skin. His fingers were twice the size of hers, and his hand swallowed hers completely, and the warmth went all the way to her chest. "Do not force it," Eli said. His voice had dropped lower, and he was looking at their hands, not the wood. "You push too hard, the blade slips. You go too careful, nothing happens. Find the middle." "The middle," Clara repeated. She was very aware of how close his face was to hers, close enough to see every shade of gray in his eyes, between too hard and too careful. That is the trick with wood. He paused. With most things. He let go of her hand and leaned back, and the distance between them opened like a door closing. Clara went back to carving. She produced something that looked like a lump with ambitions. "What is it supposed to be?" Eli asked. "A bird?" He tilted his head. "Keep going." She kept going. Shavings piled at her feet. The lump slowly acquired a suggestion of wings, a hint of a tail. It was terrible, and she knew it was terrible, and she kept cutting anyway. "The wings are wrong," she said. "Forget the wings. Get the body right first. Everything else follows." Is that wood-carving advice or life advice? Both. They sat in loaded silence. Fire popped between them. Then Clara said what she had been thinking for 3 days. "You watch me when you think I am not looking." Eli went still. "You do the same," he said. Neither looked away. "What are you afraid of, Eli? That I will leave or that I will stay?" Eli stood, crossed to the workbench, put his back to her. His shoulders were rigid as oak. "I am afraid I will lose control," he said without turning. 12 years I have kept everything in its place. Locked down. Boxed up. You walk in and everything I locked starts rattling. If I let it open. If I let myself feel any of it. I do not know if I can stop." Clara stood. Walked to within a foot of his back. Did not touch him. Close enough for him to feel the warmth of her. Then stopped fighting it. Eli turned. His eyes were wild. Not angry, not sad, alive. Alive in a way that 12 years of solitude had tried to kill and could not. You do not know what you are saying. I know exactly, because I am afraid of the same thing. This did not lead to a kiss. Eli stepped back. Clara let him go. She returned to her chair, picked up the ugly bird, and kept carving. Eli stood motionless for a long time. Then he sat at the workbench, picked up the 18th music box, and began working. They sat in the same room, each shaping something with their hands, saying nothing more. But the space between them had changed. It was no longer safe distance. It was chosen distance. And both of them knew it was shrinking. Near midnight, Clara lay in the loft, listening. Below her, Eli wound a music box. Not Lily's. A different melody. Slow and aching, like a hymn played at half speed. "Whose is that one?" she called down through the dark. "Corporal Ames," Eli said. 19 years old. Called for his mother at the end. Silence. The melody played its last notes and faded. "Wind it again," Clara said. "He should not have to listen alone." Eli wound it again. The melody filled the dark cabin, and for the first time the music was not an apology sent into the void. It was something shared. Eli did not tell Clara about the boot print he found behind the stable. He told Sargent. The horse had no opinion, but at least he did not ask why Eli was sleeping with a loaded rifle beside the chair every night. The print was fresh. City leather, thin sole, the kind of shoe no one in Elk Crossing would wear. Someone had been behind the stable while Eli and Clara were in town. Someone had stood there long enough for the snow to pack around the edges. Eli began preparing the way soldiers prepare, quietly, methodically, without telling anyone what he was preparing for. He boarded up the rear window, told Clara it was the drafts, moved the hatchet from outside the door to inside it, told her it was more convenient for splitting. He checked the snow around the cabin every morning, reading it the way other men read newspapers. Told Clara he was checking the traps. Clara was not stupid. She watched him board the window and move the hatchet and check the perimeter every morning. She said nothing. But she started keeping the fire poker next to her bedroll in the loft. Two people protecting each other without admitting they were protecting each other. It was the closest thing to trust either of them knew how to do. On the 5th day, Eli rode down to Elk Crossing alone. Nettie had been holding a leather repair kit he had ordered months ago, and he wanted it for Clara's book. The binding was ruined, but the pages could be saved if he stitched them into a new cover. He did not tell Clara that was why he was going. He said he needed salt. At the store, Nettie pulled him into the back room. "Stranger came through yesterday," she said. "Said he was a surveyor from Denver, railway company, measuring routes through the passes." Eli looked at her. "Nobody surveys in December. That is exactly what I thought." "He asked about you. By name, Eli. Said he was mapping properties along the ridge for the railway right-of-way and needed to speak with you about access." Eli went cold. "What did you tell him? That you are the meanest hermit in 50 miles and the last man any surveyor would want to bother." He bought tobacco, asked Billy Akins some questions, and rode north. Eli said nothing. "But here is the thing," Nettie continued. "He was not riding north gear. He was riding north like a man who planned to circle back. The boot print behind the stable. City leather." Eli rode back to the cabin fast. The temperature was dropping and the wind was picking up. Another storm building. He put Sargent in the stable and stood in the doorway looking at the ground behind the lean-to. More prints. Same shoes. This time they went all the way around the cabin, stopped at each window, counted the doors. The prints moved with purpose, not someone lost. Someone mapping. That night, Eli sat by the fire with the rifle across his knees and waited. Clara slept in the loft above him, her breathing slow and even. The fire burned down. The wind rose. Past midnight, Sargent huffed in the stable. Not the grisly sound. The stranger sound. Eli went out. The storm had weakened to a steady snowfall, visibility 30 yards. He circled the cabin, moving through the trees, using cover the way the army had taught him. Behind the stable at the tree line, He found the man. A thin figure crouching beside a pine trunk, notebook in hand, sketching the cabin layout by moonlight. Distance to stable, number of windows, door positions. He was so focused on his drawing that he did not hear Eli until the rifle barrel pressed against the back of his neck. The man froze. "Do not move," Eli said. "Do not shout. Turn around slow." The man turned. Narrow face, nervous eyes, city clothes under a canvas riding coat. He looked like what he was. A man who spent his life behind a desk, who had been sent into the field and did not care for it. "Name," Eli said. "Crane. Lewis Crane. Crane." "And what is a surveyor doing sketching my cabin at midnight?" "I am not a surveyor." Crane's voice shook. He was scared. "Good. I am a Pinkerton man. Out of the Denver office." Eli felt the cold settle deeper. "Not the weather. Something else." "Who hired you?" "Theodore Harlow, circuit judge from Pennsylvania. He hired me 3 weeks ago. My job was to find a woman named Clara Mercer, confirm her location, assess the defensive situation, and report back. 3 weeks. Before the crash. Before Clara landed on his mountain. Harlow had been hunting her since she left Philadelphia, and he had hired professionals." "What have you reported?" Eli asked. Crane swallowed. "One letter sent from Denver a week ago. Confirmed the woman was on Elk Ridge. Gave your name and approximate location. So he knows. He knows. He is coming, Mr. Calloway. He has got 2 men with him. Hired guns, not investigators. Pike and Garrett, they were waiting in Denver for my report." Eli stood very still. The snow fell around them. Crane looked at the rifle barrel 2 feet from his face and seemed to be calculating his odds. "You have got a choice," Eli said. "I can hold you here and deal with the consequences of holding a Pinkerton man against his will. Or I can let you walk. But if I let you walk, you go straight back to Denver and you tell your employer something for me." "What?" "Tell him I know he is coming. Tell him I will be here. And tell him this. The woman in that cabin came here running. She stopped running. And the man she stopped with has got nothing left to lose except her. Make sure he understands what that means." Crane looked at Eli's face in the snow-filtered moonlight and saw whatever was there. He nodded once, turned, and walked into the trees. Eli watched him go. Then he stood alone in the falling snow and felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders. 3 horses on his property 3 days ago. A Pinkerton scout mapping his cabin. 2 hired guns waiting in Denver. And a man with money and power and pride riding toward a mountain he had no business being on. The cabin door opened behind him. Clara stood at the threshold in Sarah's coat, her hair loose, her face pale in the moonlight. She had heard. Not everything. "Enough. How long have you known?" she asked. "Boot print behind the stable. 3 days ago." 3 days. Her voice went flat, the way it went flat when she was controlling something. "You did not tell me. I was handling it. You were handling it, the way men handle things. Alone. Without telling the person it concerns most." Eli came inside, closed the door. The fire was low. Clara stood by the hearth with her arms crossed and a look on her face that he recognized. Not fear, anger, the deep quiet kind, quiet. She told him what she needed to tell him, that she had spent her whole life being handled by men who decided what she needed to know. Her father handled her mother's illness alone until it killed him. Her stepfather handled the debts alone until he sold her. Theodore handled Martha alone until Martha died. "If you want me to trust you," she said, "you have to trust me back. That means telling me the ugly parts, all of them, even the ones you think will scare me." Eli stared at the fire. His jaw worked. The muscle in his cheek jumped. "There is something else," he said. "Something I have not told you." He told her about the letter in the drawer. The lawyer in Denver. Someone had been asking about Elijah Calloway of Lawrence County, Kansas, before Clara ever set foot on this mountain. "I burned the homestead after Sarah and Lily were buried," he said. "Neighbors saw the fire. Some of them wondered if maybe I burned it with them still inside. Did you?" They were in the ground a week before I lit the match. Cemetery records, doctors' death certificates, it is all there. But records can be questioned, and Harlow is the kind of man who would question them. Clara understood. The Denver lawyer was Harlow's doing, not to find Clara, to build a case against Eli, unstable hermit, possible arsonist, unfit to harbor a vulnerable woman. Harlow had been playing a longer game than either of them had realized. Clara sat by the fire for a long time after Eli finished. The cabin felt different, not smaller, more exposed, as though walls that had been solid were suddenly made of glass. "January 15th, she said quietly. 26 days. Eli looked at her. "If I am not back by then, my sisters lose everything." She met his eyes. "And if I go back, I lose myself." The fire cracked, the wind pushed against the walls, and the distance between the two worst choices Clara Mercer had ever faced was exactly the width of a mountain cabin. On the 6th morning, Sargent refused to eat. Eli knew 3 things that killed the horse's appetite: colic, grizzly, and strangers in the wind. He checked the belly. Fine. Checked for bear sign. None. He stood in the stable doorway, drew the cold air through his nose, and understood. He went back inside and began to prepare without telling Clara how bad it was. Checked both rifles, loaded extra rounds, positioned the hatchet inside the door instead of outside, moved the workbench to create a better sight line from the front window to the clearing. Clara watched all of this. She took Sarah's coat off the peg and buttoned it to the throat, tied her hair back. She did not pick up the fire poker. She picked up the second rifle from above the mantel. Eli looked at her. "You taught me to shoot yesterday," she said. "Do not waste the lesson. Yesterday you missed everything except the biggest tree on the mountain. Then I will stand close." They waited. The morning passed. The storm had weakened to scattered flurries, and the clouds sat low on the mountain like a gray ceiling pressing down. Just past noon, Clara was standing by the window when she saw them. "Horses," she said. Eli was beside her in 2 strides. Through the frost he could see what should not have been there. 3 riders on the switchback trail below the cabin. Moving slow but moving steady, picking their way through drifts that reached the horses' chests. "Get away from the window," Eli said, and his voice had changed. All the softness gone, replaced by something cold and precise. The soldier. The survivor. He assessed them through the glass. Led rider on a gray mare. Expensive coat, rigid posture of a man who paid other people to do physical work. 2 men flanking on darker horses. Hands near their holsters, easy in the saddle. Professionals. The kind who killed by the day and slept fine after. 2 real threats. 1 political threat. The political one was worse. Eli stepped outside and planted himself in the clearing between the cabin and the trail. Rifle loose in his hands, barrel pointed at the ground, finger near the trigger, but not on it. Not yet. The riders pulled up 20 feet away. The gray mare tossed her head, fighting the bit. The led rider controlled her with one hand, barely seeming to notice. Up close, Theodore Harlow looked exactly like what Clara had described. White hair under a black hat, heavy build wrapped in an overcoat that cost more than everything in Eli's cabin combined. A broad, fleshy face with pale blue eyes that looked like they had been carved from ice. A politician's face, built for smiling in public and doing ugly things in private. "You are a long way from anywhere," Eli said. Harlow smiled, wide and warm and absolutely empty. "Indeed I am." Theodore Harlow, Circuit Judge, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. "I am looking for a woman, my fiancée, Clara Mercer. I have reason to believe she survived a stagecoach accident in this area. Do not know any Clara Mercer?" "Of course you do not." Harlow's smile did not waver. "But the people of Elk Crossing told me all about the ghost of Elk Ridge. A hermit who came down the mountain looking like a man who had seen something worth living for. You bought extra provisions, Mr. Calloway. A man who lives alone does not suddenly double his stores without reason." Eli said nothing. Harlow reached into his coat slowly and produced a folded paper. I also have a warrant for Miss Mercer's arrest, theft of personal property. $200 taken from her stepfather's safe, signed by a federal judge and enforceable in any territory. Lot of trouble over $200. It is not about the money. It is about principle, and about a young woman who is clearly not in her right mind, fleeing her family, traveling alone into dangerous country. I am here to bring her home safely. Surely you can understand a man's concern for his intended. Eli studied Harlow the way he would study a timber rattler coiled on his porch. Calm, patient, looking for the place it would strike. Intended, Eli said, that what you call a woman whose daddy sold her to pay his debts. The smile flickered, just a fraction. Just long enough for Eli to see the real face underneath. Hard, possessive, not used to being challenged. I see she has been telling stories. Harlow's voice went smooth. Clara has a vivid imagination. It is part of her charm, but also part of her illness. The poor girl has been unstable since her father's death. Delusions, paranoia, wild accusations. Her family and I have been trying to get her proper care. Proper care in your house. As your wife, a stable home with a man who can provide for her. What is wrong with that? Ask your first wife. The silence that followed had weight. The two hired men shifted in their saddles. Harlow's pale eyes went flat. Martha died in an accident, Harlow said softly. I mourned her deeply. Carpeted stairs, Eli said. 6 steps. Healthy woman in her 30s. Must have been some accident. You are repeating a mad woman's fantasies, and you are testing my patience. Harlow straightened in the saddle and his voice hardened. But I did not come here to debate. I have the law, I have a warrant, and I have the authority of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania behind me. Then Harlow played his real card. He produced a second document. I also took the liberty of investigating you, Mr. Calloway. Former Sergeant, Union Army, 33rd Indiana Infantry. Discharged 1863, returned to Kansas to find his family deceased. Subsequently burned his homestead to the ground. Harlow paused. Applied to rejoin the Army 3 times after that. Denied 3 times. And I quote the rejection letter. Due to mental instability rendering the applicant unfit for service. The words hit Eli like rifle fire. Not in the chest. In the place behind his chest where he kept the thing he never talked about. 3 times, Mr. Calloway, 3 times you begged to go back to war because you could not face what was waiting at home. That is not a stable man. That is not a man anyone should trust with a vulnerable woman, and any territorial court will see it the same way I do. Eli's hands tightened on the rifle. His breathing changed. The phrase unfit for service echoed in his skull, and suddenly he was not on a mountain in Colorado. He was in a surgeon's office in Louisville, sitting on a wooden chair, while a man in a uniform told him he was broken and there was no place for broken men in the United States Army. He felt the shift happen. The old thing. The thing Shiloh had put inside him and 12 years alone had not taken out. The red wave that rose from somewhere below his stomach and turned the world into a simple equation. Threat, eliminate, threat, eliminate. Eli raised the rifle and fired. Not at Harlow. At the ground in front of Pike's horse, but too close. Far too close. The horse reared and screamed. Pike grabbed for his pistol. For 3 terrible seconds, the clearing was a hair trigger from a massacre. Eli chambered another round and aimed at Pike's chest. His hands were steady, his eyes were not. Pike froze with his hand on his holster. Garrett's hand stopped halfway to his gun. The moment hung. Then it passed. Nobody died. But Harlow was smiling, because Eli had done exactly what Harlow wanted. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, Harlow said quietly. You just proved my case. Inside the cabin, Clara stood at the window with the rifle in her hands. She could see everything. She knew she should step out, stand beside Eli, present the contract, deliver the speech she had been rehearsing in her head for 3 days. She could not move. Her body had locked. hands frozen on the rifle stock, feet nailed to the floor. Theodore's voice came through the walls, that voice calm, reasonable, patient. The voice he used before the backhand came. The voice that meant he had already decided and nothing she did would change it. Clara's body remembered what 3 months of running had not erased. Every time she had frozen in that parlor. Every time she had stood perfectly still while Theodore explained, very patiently, very calmly, what would happen if she did not behave. The bruises always where the dress covered them. The smile always back in place before the guests arrived. She stood at the window and could not make her legs carry her through the door. The shame of it burned hotter than the fear. Outside, Eli stood alone. Harlow delivered his final words. "I will return with proper territorial authority. A deputy marshal. Legal papers served correctly. And when I do, I will have 3 witnesses who saw you discharge a firearm at unarmed visitors without provocation." He looked at the cabin window where Clara's silhouette was visible. "And I will have a judge's assessment that the woman inside is being held by a man the United States Army declared mentally unfit." Harlow turned his horse. The 3 riders retreated down the switchback. They did not rush. Men who have won do not need to rush. Eli stood in the clearing long after they disappeared. The rifle hung from his hand like a dead thing. He knew what he had done. He knew Harlow had baited him and he had taken it. He had given the enemy exactly what they needed. He walked inside. Clara was sitting on the floor by the hearth with the rifle across her lap and her face blank. The fire poker lay 3 feet away. She had not even reached for it. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Clara said in a voice stripped to the bone, "I could not move." Eli sat in his chair, put his face in his hands. "I fired too soon. 2 failures, his and hers, sitting in a cold cabin with a hole in the ceiling and a war they had just lost. He will be back," Clara said. "With the law this time, real law. How long? 4 days to Denver. 2 to get a deputy marshal, 4 back. 10 days if the weather holds." Eli lowered his hands and looked at her. "That puts us past your deadline. January 15th, her sisters, the contract, the debt." Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry and hard, and had made some decision that Eli could not read. "Then we have 10 days, she said, to make sure he has nothing to come back to." The morning after Harlow's visit, Clara threw up in the snow behind the cabin. She wiped her mouth, walked to the trapline alone, and spent an hour resetting snares with bleeding fingers. The wire was too tight on some and too loose on others, and none of them would catch anything. She reset them anyway. Eli found her kneeling in the snow beside the 5th trap, hands shaking, face raw from the cold. He did not say, "Come inside," did not say, "You should rest." He knelt beside her, took the wire from her hands, and showed her the angle again. His fingers moved over hers, adjusting, correcting. Then he stood and walked to the next trap without a word. Clara followed. They checked all 6 traps in silence. Caught nothing. It did not matter. The walking mattered. The doing mattered. Back at the cabin, they dealt with the wreckage of yesterday in different ways. Eli went quiet, deeper quiet than his usual quiet. Not brooding, something more focused. He sat at the workbench and worked on the 18th music box with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had fitted the brass mechanism inside. He wound the key. The melody began, bright notes tumbling over each other like water over stones. 30 seconds. Then it jammed, stopped dead. He adjusted the cylinder, wound it again. The melody played. 32 seconds this time. Jammed again. Eli's jaw tightened. He opened the box, examined the mechanism, reset a tiny brass pin, closed it, wound it again. 30 seconds, jam. Clara went the other direction. She split firewood until her palms cracked open again. Cleaned the cabin floor to ceiling, reorganized the provisions by type and weight. She moved because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant the freeze would come back. The lock in her muscles, the ice in her legs, the paralysis that had kept her behind a window while Eli stood alone. In the afternoon, Clara sat by the fire holding the poker, not for defense. She was staring at it. "I had the rifle," she said. Eli looked up from the workbench. "I had it in my hands. I knew what to do. I knew what to say. And my legs would not work." She turned the poker over in her hands. "3 months I have been telling myself I escaped, that I was brave, that I chose to run. But I did not choose anything. I just ran. Running is not the same as standing." She set the poker down. When I heard his voice through the wall, that calm voice, my body went back. Back to his parlor. Back to his study. Back to every time he explained very reasonably, very patiently, what would happen if I did not behave. And I froze the way I always froze, because that is what he trained me to do. The word trained. She used it deliberately, the way Eli talked about soldiers, the way he talked about horses. Training is what you do to things you own. Eli set down the music box. He crossed the cabin and sat on the floor beside her, his back against the hearthstone, close but not touching. The same position she had been in during the carving lesson, but reversed. "At Shiloh," he said. "First time I heard cannon fire, I dropped my rifle and crawled under a supply wagon. Stayed there 40 minutes. My sergeant had to drag me out by the boots." Clara looked at him. "Second time I heard cannon fire, I dropped my rifle and stood there. Did not crawl, did not fight. Just stood." "Third time?" Clara asked. "Third time I picked up my rifle." He paused. "That is all it is, Clara. It is not about being brave. It is about how many times you are willing to stand up after your body tells you to crawl." This was not Eli fixing Clara. This was a soldier recognizing another soldier's experience. Clara had not been a wife escaping a husband. She had been a prisoner of war, and Eli, for the first time, treated her that way, with the respect one survivor gives another. That evening, Clara turned the lens back on him. "You fired first," she said. "I know, he wanted you to. I know that too." "Why?" Eli was silent for a long time. Then he said it. He said, "Unfit for service." And I was back in the surgeon's office in Louisville. The man looked at me like I was a horse with a broken leg. Something to be put down, not something to be fixed. I have heard those words in my head every day for 12 years. And when Harlow said them out loud in front of me, I stopped thinking and started reacting. "You lost control," Clara said. "Yes. Is that what you meant? When you told me you were afraid of losing control?" Eli met her eyes, and Clara saw something in them that was honest and ugly and brave all at once. "Not just feelings," he said. "Not just wanting you. The other thing, the violence. It is in me, Clara. Shiloh put it there, and 12 years alone did not take it out. I can go months without it surfacing. Then someone says the right words in the right voice, and I am back in the mud with a bayonet and blood on my hands." The truth sat between them. Not pretty, not romantic. Clara looked at the man she was falling in love with and saw clearly what he was. Someone capable of great tenderness and real violence. And the line between the two was thinner than either of them wanted to admit. "Then stop fighting it alone," Clara said. Same words she had used before. Different meaning. Not about romance now. About survival. About admitting the wound was too big to carry without help. They sat in silence. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind picked up again, pushing against the walls, reminding them both that the world was still trying to get in. Later that evening, Clara was washing the supper dishes. Eli came to fill a cup of water from the pot on the stove. They stood beside each other at the basin. Cramped space. Clara turned to reach for the drying cloth. Her face was close to his. Both froze. Eli said it barely above a whisper. "I warned you." Clara put her wet hand on his chest. She felt his heart beat through the flannel shirt. Fast, unsteady. The heartbeat of a man who was terrified. "I know," she said. She kissed him, slow. He did not respond for 1 second. His whole body went rigid, bracing for something. A flinch. a blow, the thing that always comes when you reach for something you want. Then his hands came up and framed her face the way you hold something you are afraid will break. And he kissed her back, not with 12 years of loneliness, with right now, this moment, this woman, this choice. His hands shook against her cheeks. She felt it. She did not fix it. She shook too. Because this was the first time in 3 months for her, and 12 years for him, that someone's touch was not about ownership. It was about asking. When they separated, Eli pressed his forehead against hers and kept his eyes closed. "This is a mistake," he said. "Probably. I have nightmares. Bad ones. I wake up swinging. I have not slept through a full night in 3 months." He opened his eyes. This close, she could see every shade of gray, from storm dark to silver. "I am going to be the death of you, Clara Mercer. Or the life of you. Depends which one of us is more stubborn." That night, Eli wound the 18th music box. The melody played, 35 seconds. 5 more than the day before. Then it jammed. "It is still stuck," Clara said from the loft. "I know, I cannot figure out why." "The mechanism is right. Maybe it is not finished yet. The box is finished. Maybe the box is not what needs finishing." Eli sat in the dark with the silent music box in his hands and understood exactly what she meant, and had no idea what to do about it. Territorial Marshal Marcus Teague rode into Elk Crossing on a Thursday morning with 2 deputies and a face like a man who had been chewing on something unpleasant for 400 miles. Theodore Harlow arrived Friday with a lawyer from Denver and a smile that could freeze a creek in July, and the mountain decided that Saturday was a fine day for an avalanche. But before the mountain spoke, the law did its work. Teague was 50 years old, former Army, and carried himself with the unhurried patience of a man who had seen enough violence to know that most of it could be avoided by showing up early and listening carefully. He was not impressed by titles. He was not impressed by money. He was impressed by evidence, and he had been collecting it since Nettie Rollins' letter reached his office in Denver 2 weeks before. He took Clara's statement in the back room of Nettie's store. She told it straight, no drama, the contract, the debt, Theodore's first wife, the stagecoach, the crash, Eli, the Pinkerton scout mapping the cabin, the 3 riders with guns. Teague wrote it all down in a neat hand and asked questions that told Clara he already knew more than he was letting on. "Miss Mercer," he said, "have you heard the name Ellen Marsh?" Clara shook her head. "Mrs. Marsh filed a complaint against Theodore Harlow 9 weeks ago in St. Louis. Coercion, intimidation, threats. She withdrew the complaint under pressure. But when my office received Nettie's letter and began looking into Judge Harlow's affairs, Mrs. Marsh contacted us again. She is prepared to testify." Clara's hands went still. "I was not the first. No, ma'am, you were not." Teague had more. The St. Louis complaint had prompted a second examination of the coroner's report on Martha Harlow's death. New questions had been raised about the injuries. Fractures inconsistent with a simple fall down 6 carpeted steps. Consistent with something else. Manual force applied to the neck. Not enough for an indictment, but enough for an investigation. The machinery of justice, which had been aimed at Clara for 3 months, was slowly, quietly, beginning to turn the other way. But Harlow had his own machinery. He arrived Friday morning with a Denver attorney named Bancroft, a man who spoke in paragraphs and smiled like a snake in Sunday clothes. Bancroft presented the territorial warrant for Clara's arrest. Theft of personal property. $200 and the marriage contract itself. Valid charges. Technically correct. Teague could not ignore a valid warrant. The law was the law, even when the law was being used as a weapon. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. This was not cowboys and blizzards. This was the system, the quiet, patient, paperwork-driven machinery that had crushed women like her for centuries, politely, legally, with signatures and seals and men in suits who never raised their voices because they did not need to. While Clara and Teague dealt with the legal maneuvering, Eli went looking for Tom Brightwater. He found the blacksmith at his forge, hammering a horseshoe. Tom did not look up. "The riders from Mill Creek," Eli said. "Where are they now?" "Pike left for Denver 3 days ago. Injured hand. The other one, Garrett, is at Billy's saloon, drinking and talking." "Talking about what?" Tom set down his hammer and looked at Eli for the first time. "About how he watched a circuit judge from Pennsylvania slap him across the face in front of strangers for refusing to draw on a man." He paused. That one might be useful. A man who gets slapped by his employer in public tends to remember details. Details a marshal might find interesting. Tom picked up his hammer again. Then he said the most words Eli had ever heard from him. "That judge thinks he owns her. Your people have a habit of that. Owning land, owning people, owning the water in the river, then being surprised when everything runs away." Eli found Garrett at Billy's saloon. The man sat alone at a corner table with a whiskey bottle that was more empty than full and a bruise on his cheekbone that had turned the color of a week-old plum. Eli sat down across from him and said nothing, just ordered 2 whiskeys and waited. Garrett talked, about the slap, about Pike's hand, about how the old man did not even ask if Pike was all right after Eli's shot clipped his horse, about things he had seen in Harlow's hotel room in Denver, letters, documents, a locked case Harlow checked obsessively, and about the way Harlow talked about Clara when he thought only hired men were listening. "He does not want her back because he loves her," Garrett said. "He wants her back because she left. Nobody leaves Theodore Harlow, that is what he kept saying. Nobody leaves." Eli bought him another whiskey. Then he walked out into the cold and stood on the boardwalk and looked up at the mountain where a woman was waiting for him in a cabin he had built to die in. That evening they rode home on Sargent. Clara sat in front, Eli's arms around her, holding the reins. The trail climbed through pines heavy with snow, and the world was quiet except for the creak of leather and the steady fall of hooves. "Clara." "Stay. I am staying. You told me to stay at the cabin, and I came to town anyway, so clearly I do not follow instructions. Not tonight. Stay. Stay on this mountain. With me." Long silence. Cold wind. Sergeant's breath rising in white clouds. "Is that a proposal?" "It is everything I have got. You do not even have a ring. I have got a mountain. And 18 music boxes. One of them does not work right." Clara turned on horseback, awkward and unbalanced, and looked at his face. Scar, close-trimmed beard, gray eyes that were terrified behind a mask of calm. "Yes, yes, yes. But I need a ring, and you need to learn to cook properly, and the cabin needs more rooms because I am not sleeping in that loft forever." Eli said nothing. Clara felt his arms tighten around her waist, then loosen, then tighten again, like a man holding something he did not dare believe was real. They married 2 days later in the Elk Crossing church. Clara wore a blue dress that Nettie had altered overnight, working by lamplight with hands that had sewn everything from saddle blankets to wedding gowns in 30 years on the frontier. Eli wore his only clean shirt and had trimmed his beard close enough that the scar on his jaw showed clearly. Clara loved that. It meant he was not hiding anymore. Sheriff Mackey stood as witness. Nettie stood as witness, and mother of the bride and general manager of the occasion, directing everyone with the same authority she used to run the post office. Tom Brightwater stood outside the church door. He did not come inside, but he was there, and that was enough. "I do," Clara said, and her voice rang clear as a bell. "I do," Eli said, and his voice cracked on the word do, and he did not care who heard it. They rode back up the mountain that afternoon. At the trailhead, Tom Brightwater was waiting. Eli stopped the horse. Tom pointed east. "Harlow rode out this morning with his lawyer. Toward Denver. Running. Men like that do not run. They regroup." Tom looked at Clara. He filed a motion before he left. "Teague told me, territorial court hearing. Demands the contract be returned as stolen property and Clara remanded to Pennsylvania jurisdiction." Silence on the mountain trail. Wind in the pines. "When is the hearing?" Eli asked. "January 12th, 3 days before the deadline." The hearing was set for Tuesday in Denver. On Monday morning, a letter arrived at Nettie Rollins' post office from Philadelphia. And on Monday night, Elk Ridge got its first avalanche of the season, which buried the Denver road under 40 feet of snow and stone and broken timber, and made the entire question of territorial courts temporarily irrelevant. The mountain decided. Not people, not law, not money. The mountain. Eli and Clara stood on the ridge and looked at the wall of white where the road used to be. Wind blew snow off the top in long plumes that caught the sunlight like white flags. "Mountain does not care about territorial courts," Eli said. "Or marriage contracts," Clara said. "Or anything except itself." The avalanche bought time but solved nothing. When the road cleared, Harlow would refile. The machinery would start turning again. But for now, the mountain had spoken. And when the mountain spoke, everyone listened. The letter that arrived before the avalanche was from Margaret Mercer. Clara read it, standing in Nettie's back room with her hand shaking so hard she had to set it down twice. She read it 3 times to make sure the words were real. Margaret had acted, not out of Clara's plan, not from Eli's protection, on her own. Clara's older sister had walked into their stepfather's parlor, looked him in the eye, and laid out what she knew. The contract, the debt, Harlow's history, the first wife, the second woman in St. Louis. Margaret had told their stepfather that she would publish every detail in the Philadelphia Inquirer if he did not cooperate. The stepfather, who was a coward more than a villain, who had sold his stepdaughter because it was easier than facing his debts like a man, folded like a paper house in a rainstorm. He signed an affidavit before a notary public. In it, he stated that the marriage contract had been executed under duress, that the $200 Clara took was inheritance money from their father's estate that had been held improperly, and that he withdrew all claims and complaints against Clara Mercer. The affidavit was enclosed, notarized, legal, real. Clara held the paper and cried. Not the stifled tears of the first night in the loft, not the burning tears of failure after Harlow's visit. These were clean tears, the kind that come from realizing you are not alone, that the sister you were trying to protect was protecting you right back from 1,000 miles away. But the affidavit was not enough by itself. It killed the theft charge. It invalidated the stepfather's consent to the contract. But Harlow could still argue the contract itself was valid. He could claim he had negotiated in good faith, that Clara had consented. He needed to be stopped completely. Clara made her decision sitting in Nettie's back room with tear tracks drying on her cheeks and her father's book of poetry in her satchel and her husband's ring on her finger. When the road clears and the hearing is rescheduled, she said, "I am going, not to run, to testify." Eli looked at her from across the room. "You do not have to. The affidavit kills the theft charge. It does not kill Theodore. He will refile. He will find another angle. He will keep coming until someone stands in front of him and tells the truth where people can hear it." "Clara," his voice was careful, "you told me once. First time you crawl, second time you stand, third time you pick up the rifle." She looked at him with steady eyes. "This is my 3rd time." 2 weeks later, the road cleared. They rode to Elk Crossing on a bright, cold morning. Clara, Eli, Nettie, and Sheriff Mackey. The hearing had been relocated from Denver to Elk Crossing at Marshal Teague's request, given that the events had occurred within his jurisdiction. A territorial judge named Harlan Price rode in from Colorado Springs. Harlow arrived with his Denver lawyer, Bancroft. The hearing took place in the town hall, which was also the schoolroom and the place where they held Saturday dances. 20 citizens of Elk Crossing sat on benches meant for children. Tom Brightwater stood by the back wall with his arms crossed. Nettie Rollins sat in the front row with a notebook and a pencil, and the expression of a woman who intended to remember every word. Bancroft presented the case for Harlow. Valid contract, runaway fiancé, stolen documents. He spoke in measured tones that made everything sound reasonable and correct and legal. He was good. He had been doing this for 20 years and he knew how to make wrong sound right. Then Clara stood. She did not have a lawyer. She had her voice. Judge Price, a thin man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness that had followed him across 3 territories, asked her to state her account. Clara did not give a speech. She answered his questions, direct, specific, without drama. She told how the contract was arranged, without her knowledge, signed by her stepfather in exchange for debt forgiveness, while Clara served tea in the next room and did not learn of it until a week before the wedding. She told the terms. Clara as property. Transfer of all legal rights to Harlow upon marriage. A clause that prevented her from owning land, opening accounts, or leaving the marital home without written permission. She told about Martha Harlow, what the housekeeper had said, the bruises hidden by high collars and long sleeves, the locked rooms. The night Martha died and Theodore was already dressed and composed when the doctor arrived past midnight. She told what Theodore had done when they were alone. She told it in plain language, which was worse than any dramatic rendering. The calm voice, the patience, the way he explained exactly what would happen if she did not comply, the bruises always where the dress covered them, the smile always back in place before the guests arrived. Clara spoke for 11 minutes. Her voice broke once on the word sisters, when she described learning that Margaret and Jane would suffer for her escape. She pressed her fist against her mouth, took a breath, and continued. Bancroft objected. Judge Price overruled. Harlow sat rigid in his chair, his face flushing in increments that everyone in the room could see. Then Garrett testified. He told about the slap, about the way Harlow talked about Clara in private, about the locked case, about the 3 words Harlow kept repeating when he thought only hired men were listening. Nobody leaves Theodore Harlow. Then Teague presented his evidence. Ellen Marsh's renewed complaint from St. Louis, the questions about Martha Harlow's death, the Pinkerton scout hired to surveil a private cabin, the armed men brought across state lines to collect a woman who did not want to be collected. Judge Price looked at Theodore Harlow for a long time. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of Nettie's pencil and the wind outside. Then Judge Price ruled. The marriage contract was void, executed under duress, without the bride's consent, in exchange for debt considerations that constituted coercion under territorial law. The contract belonged to Clara Mercer as evidence of the coercion, not to Theodore Harlow as a claim of ownership. The theft charges were dismissed. The stepfather's affidavit removed the complainant, and the money in question was inheritance held improperly. Clara Mercer was free to remain in Colorado Territory as a citizen in good standing. On the matter of Theodore Harlow, Judge Price referred the record to the Pennsylvania Judiciary for investigation of Martha Harlow's death, and to the Territorial Marshal's Office for investigation of coercion, intimidation, and the employment of armed agents without lawful authority in Colorado Territory. Harlow was not arrested that day. Not in that courtroom. But the machinery had reversed. The papers that once hunted Clara now hunted him. Teague escorted Harlow to the Denver road with instructions that were clear and final. Leave Colorado. If the Pennsylvania investigation produced an indictment, the state penitentiary would be waiting. Outside the town hall, Harlow mounted his horse. Clara stood on the boardwalk, Eli beside her. Not in front, beside. Harlow looked at her. The mask was gone. What was underneath was old and tired and furious, and for the first time Clara had ever seen, afraid. You will regret this, he said. No, Clara said. I will not. Harlow rode east. 3 people watched him go. Clara, Eli, and Nettie Rollins, who was already composing a letter to the Philadelphia Inquirer in her head, and did not intend to leave out a single detail. That evening they rode back up the mountain. The cabin was cold, the fire dead to ash. They rebuilt it together. Eli split wood while Clara stacked it. Clara made coffee while Eli tended Sergeant. They moved around each other in the small space with the ease of two people who had already learned the hard lessons. How to share, how to fight, how to start again. Eli sat at the workbench. He picked up the 18th music box. The walnut case was smooth and warm in his hands. He had wound it 20 times in the past 2 weeks, 30 seconds, 32, 35, always jamming. He wound the key. The melody began, bright notes tumbling over each other like water over stones. 30 seconds, 35, 40. He held his breath. 45, 50. The melody reached a phrase it had never played before, a high, clear resolution, the musical equivalent of a door opening, and it played through. Every note, no jam, no stop, all the way to the end. The cabin was silent except for the last vibration fading from the brass cylinder. Clara looked up from the hearth. She had heard. Eli turned the box over. On the bottom, carved in his careful hand, 2 words, "Start again." He carried it to the shelf and set it at the end of the row. 18th in line, 17 apologies and one that was not. Clara stood, walked to the mantel, placed her finished carving beside the music boxes. The bird with uneven wings, an oversized head, one leg shorter than the other, beak open. If you looked at it right, in the right light, it looked like it was about to sing. 18 music boxes and one ugly bird, Clara said. It is not ugly. It has one leg shorter than the other. So do I. Shiloh, a pause. We match. She laughed. He laughed, and the sound of it filled the cabin the way music fills the boxes, completely, from the inside out, leaving no room for silence. Later, in the loft that was theirs now, Clara took Eli's hand. She placed it on her belly, held it there, waited. Eli went very still. His fingers spread against her stomach, and she felt them tremble, and she knew he was thinking of another woman. Another time. A child who called for her papa and never heard the answer. Eli, stay with me, right here, right now. He closed his eyes. She watched him breathe through it, the terror, the grief, the memory. In through the nose, slow, steady, the way he had taught her on the mountain that first morning, present, here, now. When he opened his eyes, they were wet, but they were here, in this cabin, in this moment, in this life they had chosen. I am scared, he said. I know. I am scared, and I am happy, and I do not know how to be both at the same time. You learn. The way you learn everything. Start rough. Keep going. Eventually it starts to look like what it is supposed to be. Like your bird, Eli said. Like my bird. He pulled her close and held her. Not the desperate grip of a drowning man. The steady hold of a man who had found solid ground after 12 years at sea and intended to stand on it for the rest of his life. I am going to build a bigger cabin, he said into her hair. 2 rooms, maybe 3. A proper kitchen, windows that face east so you can read by morning light. And a long shelf, Clara said. For what? For all the music boxes you are going to make? Not apologies, Eli. Not anymore. New ones, for new people, for whoever this is. She pressed his hand against her belly. For whoever comes after. Eli wound the 18th music box one more time. The melody played all the way through, every note, bright and wandering and complete. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder and hummed along because she had learned the tune by heart. Outside, the stars turned over the Colorado mountains. The spring thaw was still months away, but somewhere under the snow, something had already started. Eli looked at the shelf. 17 apologies, 1 beginning, 1 ugly bird. Going to need a longer shelf, Clara said quietly. Eli did not answer. He stood up, got the measuring tape from the workbench, and started measuring the wall. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.